In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I create a beautiful beach landscape inspired by Maui using the primary palette with permanent white, yellow ochre, just for some earthy tones, even though I could mix it from lemon yellow, alizarin crimson, and ultramarine. Lemon yellow right here, alizarin crimson, ultramarine for a kind of warmer blue. And I am also using linden green because I know that with those vibrant greens and the light and the foliage, I really can't get that with lemon yellow and ultramarine. So I am going to go ahead and use some linden green. So right here we have more or less the primary palette. And I'm going to create a painting with this. Later on, I'm going to add brilliant green, but that is really about it. And I want to show you that you can create a really nice painting with just a few colors, right? You don't need the whole gamut, although sometimes it's really fun to expand. I will say I was tempted to expand and add some colors, but I stuck to the primary palette to really hone in the idea that you can stick with the primary palette and create all the colors that you need. So first I'm going to sketch out my drawing, right? My painting. And I'm just using a warm felt pen that bleeds a little bit, but not too much. And I always like using warm colors because I find that it just blends better when it seeps through. Like sometimes part of my pen sketch seeps through and I kind of like that. I think this is the brand Le Pen. No, it's not Le Pen, but is a similar brand. And I use Le Pen, that brand, all the time. As long as it's, kind of water soluble, but doesn't bleed all over the place, you should be fine. What I don't recommend using is Sharpie because Sharpie is just too dark. It stands out too much. So don't use Sharpie or ballpoint pen. Pencil kind of smears as well. So that's why I like using a simple felt pen. Now, sketching wise, I'm going to keep it simple, right? I just want to know where my main masses are, where the palm tree is going to happen. And I will paint over this and I will adjust. But right now, as you can see, a quick sketch is all I need. So once I have my sketch done, I'm going to first tone my canvas with yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of lemon yellow. And I don't want it too dark because I know that the parts where the water is really bright and reflects the sun, I want to keep that pretty light as possible, just a slight tone of color. So you see that it's pretty wet right now, but I am going to take a paper towel and I am going to dry it up a little bit, just so that when I put down my paints, it doesn't kind of melt everywhere and when on wet it splays out everywhere a little bit, and I don't always like that when I want tight edges, so I'm just drying it up a little bit right now. And you can also see that by doing that I've lightened up the toning a little bit so it's not as dark, and I still find that keeping a little bit of tone in the sky, even in the water, helps a lot. So what I'm gonna go ahead and do first is I'm going to block in my shadow masses in the cliffside. And because I'm working with the limited palette, what I love is that, there's really so many colors you can mix, right? It's not like I have a huge choice, but I'm mixing a variety of warm and cool. So ultramarine and alizarin crimson create purple. And then with that yellow ochre, it just brings that earthiness back a little bit so that it's not just straight purple that I'm putting down on these cliff sides, which the local color is kind of a brownish dark brown, right? So I'm keeping in mind the local color of the cliff side as well. And that will just bring a little bit of that earthiness back. So I'm using my 1-inch flat brush right now, and you can see that's really helping to just get graphic shapes. And I use this for the majority of my painting. You'll see that at the end, I do go to a smaller round brush, which I've been really liking recently. But when I block in a painting, I really do love using the big flat brush. And I'm moving slowly too. I'm not moving too fast. I want to make sure that I can that the temperature is making sense and my shapes are making sense, and I'm grouping and simplifying when I need to. But the tricky part, I will admit, is that there was a glare on my side when I was painting. So I actually couldn't see my colors too well. And I apologize in advance for the slight glare that you'll see with the wet gouache being put down. So right now it's kind of glary because the gouache is wet, but at least you can see the colors that I'm mixing, and that will help you kind of figure out. But because everything is in shadow right now, I'm just kind of mixing all my colors together and really finding these beautiful grays, right? These grays from basically complementary colors, because blue and red make purple, but then with the lemon yellow or the yellow ochre, that complement balances everything out. So I'm just going to continue to block in all my shadow shapes, because that will emphasize my light shapes, right? And so by contrast, you're carving out both the light and the shadows simultaneously. And this is what I love about the primary palette, right? Because you can get really good at mixing the colors that you need through the primaries and the secondaries. And with the primaries and the secondaries, you make your grays, right? So really explore that if you're just starting out in gouache, or you're just entering into your journey of painting and color mixing. I like to advocate for a simpler palette to start off, because you don't get overwhelmed with all the different colors, the names of different brands. I'm using Winsor and Newton, but other brands might have different names for very similar colors, so I get that it can be confusing. And so just start off with lemon yellow, red, a dark red, and ultramarine, and white. You always need a lot of white with gouache. That's a big tip. And I use lemon yellow because with alizarin crimson and lemon yellow, I can mix a warmer yellow. Whereas if I'm needing something a little cooler, I can't get that, right, with already the warmer yellow. So that's why with a really stripped down palette, I use lemon yellow instead of something like permanent yellow deep, which is a warmer yellow. I also don't use cadmium red because I find it very potent, very powerful. It's too much. You just grab a little bit and it just destroys the color that you're trying to make. It's very, very strong and very hard to control. So I love alizarin crimson because it's darker, it's earthier, it's a little bit cooler. But paired with ultramarine, it makes a really pretty purple. So I like alizarin crimson. That's pretty much in my basic stash most of the time. Same with ultramarine. Ultramarine, a little tip that I'll share now is that if you mix ultramarine with white, it makes for great atmospheric color. And I just found this out recently. So no other color, just ultramarine and white. I'm going to be trying that later on, but actually I'm doing that right now with the distant palm trees, right? I want them to be really simple silhouettes. I'm not going to fuss over it. And now you can see that I've switched to a round brush to get those kind of roundy, rugged shapes. And I'm putting it down quickly. And you might have a question. You might think, why am I working like midground to background instead of background to foreground? And that's a really great question. And the reason is because I actually like to carve my shapes using the background. And I actually never work from background to foreground. I don't know why my brain doesn't work very well that way. I start with the darkest masses always. So you see right now, I'm starting with the areas in shadow because that's kind of the area of highest contrast against the ocean. So that's what my eye goes to first. So I'm going to put down the sky later. I'm going to put down that distant mountain later. It's not a mountain, but I'm going to use the background to carve the midground and the foreground. And you can see I'm doing that with the water right now, right? By using a round brush, and my canvas is tilted right now, by the way, because to help with the glare. So that's why it's angled a little bit. You can see that I'm mixing alizarin crimson, blue, and a lot of white to get that color of the water, but I know that it can't be too dark. So that's why mixing a lot of white will help. Now, if you're new to gouache, you'll find something really frustrating is that gouache tends to dry darker. Okay, so you put something down, you're going to see this real time. This painting didn't give me so much grief, but in the past, most of the time, I can't get my sky color ever right the first time. So you'll see it happen. You'll see it as it dries. It will dry a little bit darker, and you just adjust by building up texture, building up opaqueness, and I just love to build up texture with gouache that way, and that's why you see a lot of texture in a lot of my paintings. And that is just the specific way that I paint. Other people paint differently, but that's just how I love to play with gouache. Now, what you can see now is that what I haven't touched in the water is that I haven't touched the highlight. Okay, I want to leave that the tone of the paper. And later on, I'll add a little bit more, but the tone of the paper, another tip is that if you leave the lightest lights, the tone of the paper that you've toned this wash of yellow ochre, that will actually be the most vibrant area and light that you can actually get with gouache. It's actually not mixing white with permanent yellow deep, although you can replicate it. It just doesn't have that same glow as if you were to leave and have parts of the canvas, but that tone peeking through. So that's why I'm being kind of careful to not cover my whole ocean with blue, light blue. And I'm leaving the tone, and that will also help me kind of develop my values slowly that way. Now you can see I'm blocking the back, the distant mountains. I feel like they're not mountains. I'm calling it wrong, but I'm just going to call it mountains because I can't think of the word right now. And I'm blocking that in. And then soon I will block in the sky as well, which is filled with these beautiful backlit clouds. So I'm going to have to find a way to simplify them and, make them work for my painting because I don't want to copy every single cloud specifically. Now you can see that I've switched to a smaller round brush here. This round brush is great for getting in those little crevices, although I will say that even with my flat brush, I could get a dot mark making if I wanted to, right? So the flat brush is really versatile that way. And now you can see I'm blocking in the sky, right? And something that I like to say is that in all my paintings, I try to block in the whole painting as fast as I can. Not as fast as I can, but I want to make sure that I do block in the whole painting more or less before I'm honing in on specific areas of my painting, because I want to make sure that all my values work with each other, right? If I'm just really focusing on one part of a painting and neglecting other parts, I'm not really building up my painting as a whole, and then I'll find that I'll have to adjust other parts, and one part will be more refined than another part. And to me, it's more fun to be able to see the whole painting build up more or less equally, right? So I do go from one area to another, and now I'm building up the sky. And you can see that with the sky, because I have a limited palette, I am just mixing ultramarine, a teeny bit of red, because I don't want it to be too warm, right? I want it to contrast from the ocean a little bit. So I want the sky to be cooler. So because my only blue is ultramarine, I really just am going to mix ultramarine and white. For the top part of the sky, you'll see later on where it's a clear sky and there's not a lot of clouds. So that's what I love about the primary limited palette. Because you're restricted in your color options, you just make it work with what you have, and then things just seem to work, right? So I'm now going to go back to my cliffside because I want to start refining some of the shapes and really playing with how I can push temperature in the shadow side of those cliffs. Now, what I like about doing something like this is that the photo has really sucked out all the color and the subtle temperatures that you can see. in real life. And I actually took this photo in real life. I was there and it was someone's beautiful home, their view. And I really wanted to paint it at the time, but I didn't have time. So I took a photo with the mind of painting it later. And so I have this idea in my mind of what I felt when I saw it and how I could push, the temperatures and the shadows way more than what you see in the photo, which basically looks like dark gray or something, right? And that's why I'm an advocate of not painting from photos when you are just starting out in your painting journey. Studying from life is so important. But when you've studied enough from life, then you know how to take a photo and you know how to push it past the photo, right? Which is what I'm going to show you, what I am showing you right now. And you're going to see that takes a little bit of searching for me. The painting goes through ups and downs. There's sometimes when I'm like, this is not going anywhere. And because there is such a glare on my side of the painting, I was painting at an angle and it was just kind of funny. So I wasn't really sure what I was putting down, and I had to let my paints dry a little bit before moving on. So you'll see the evolution. But right now, I'm really playing around with pushing that atmospheric blue even in the cliffs. Because from painting in Maui for a week, I remember that, there's so much actually blue in the rocks because of atmospheric perspective that I really want to push. But I'm trying to find that right balance because when something's too blue, it feels funny because it's not the local color. So a common mistake that I see is that people push maybe the blue shadows, or they push the bounce light, and then they forget the local color, whatever they're painting. So I want to make sure that no matter what, I still have a little bit of yellow ochre in my blue purple mixture of shadow, something to balance out and counteract that purple, right? And again, that means we're playing with complementary colors. And that's what brings those beautiful, subtle grays in, right? Because grays are mixed with the primary color, like yellow, and then a secondary color like purple, okay? You can see now that I brought in brilliant green because I felt like I was getting kind of a one-note green with just linden green and lemon yellow, and I actually personally really like brilliant green. A little trick that I have is mixing brilliant green with a little bit of alizarin crimson actually gets you some really neat warmish, sappy greens because again, they're complements, right? So the brilliant green is very brilliant, yes, but then the alizarin crimson kind of monitors it, right? It balances it out. So you get kind of the best of both worlds. So I did squeeze a little bit of that in the bottom just to pop those beautiful greens. Because honestly, the greens in Maui are so special. They're so different. Like they're so different from, let's say, California greens, which are more deserty, more earthy, more sappy. The greens in Maui are so vibrant and so like such a variety of cool and warm. So sometimes you really do need those extra colors to capture the true essence of the landscape, right? So right now I would say, my paintings, it's still a basic block in. There's nothing really amazing about it. I'm still figuring things out. So I would say I'm still in the block in phase, but I'm starting to capture the essence, right? I'm starting to figure out my values, making sure that everything is not too dark or not too light, right? So I'm painting very much in a mid-key kind of value key. And so keeping that in mind, I know that if I pop something too dark, it's not going to work. And something too light might not work as well in the wrong place. Okay. So really have to pop my lightest lights and my darkest darks in the right places. For example, if I pop the dark in the middle cliff in the back, it would break the atmospheric perspective, right? And I think you'll see me do that later on. I just start to put some values that don't work. Right now you can see, I want to show you how really you can be really delicate with the flat brush and even just put a dot or a line, right? That's what I really love about the flat brush. It's so versatile. And when you get good at just turning it and, this and that and getting the strokes that you want, I've done many, many paintings with just a flat brush and a round brush. In fact, when I started off in gouache, I only used a flat brush. And then when I got introduced to the round brush, I hated it because I didn't know how to use it. And then, of course, it took practice to use the round brush, and then I love the round brush, and now I use both. So you'll see me alternating back and forth, and it almost is intuitive. Like I don't think, oh, now is the time to use a round brush. I just know that maybe a round brush would help now. The round brush is almost like a drawing tool, so it's great to kind of get these more lyrical, wispy shapes. And the flat brush is really great for bringing back that structure when I've kind of lost it in maybe too many, I don't know, I have lost the structure a little bit and I need to bring back that readability, that graphic essence. So I'd say that right now, I have my value structure there. You can see that I still kept the tone. Now it's about starting to refine the shapes, right? Adding the lights against the rocks, the glisten of the water, like on the edge of the rocks, which will highlight the rocks as well. And you can see the technique I'm using now is that I'm dry brushing, and I love dry brushing. Dry brushing is a really great technique for something like water on a sunny day because you just dry brush basically by just picking up a lot of paint and no water and just dragging your brush across. And it mimics that glisten of water quite effectively with minimal work. So it's a technique that I really like to do. Dry brushing is not only great for things like water glistening, but things like texture and foliage, anything like when you want to have, kind of want to taper the edge and blend. Instead of using a lot of water to blend, you can kind of use dry brushing to effectively get a gradient. So that's why I like gouache, because it's very versatile that way. And you'll see me start to dry brush a little bit more later on in the painting. And how I like to build up a painting is, you could see that in the beginning I started off quite wet. In fact, this painting was quite wet for half the time, and it was very frustrating because it was very glary for me. So it's usually I start off wet, but very quickly I'll go to dry on dry because gouache dries quickly, and I'll just be dry brushing and layering that way. This painting, for some reason, took forever to dry because I kept using too much water. And this often happens when I start off with a fresh virgin palette. I say virgin palette when it's clean. And as you can see, I have a clean canvas for you so you can see my colors. But oftentimes if you see my palette on Instagram or other places, it's quite messy because I've mixed so many colors already, and I love reusing those grays. So usually my paints are a lot more dry because of that. So you can see here that I've blocked in a lot of the sky, the blue of the sky with ultramarine and white. And I'm sorry, the recording accidentally stopped. So I was painting and I didn't know that it had stopped. But I really just mixed ultramarine and white. And then the rest is kind of the tone of the canvas seeping through. But I'm not done with the sky yet. I'm going to go back and add the backlit aspect. But again, I like to bop around my painting everywhere, right? And now you can see that because I've added my sky, it actually affects the way that you see the other values around, right? And so now I'm trying to see if I can just darken some values a little bit, although it's a hit or miss. I might now I'm starting to take away some of those nice atmospheric blues. I'm trying to bring in some warms in those distant rocks as well. And it's really just that play on warm and cool temperature, warm and cool, and really finding that balance that was really tricky in this painting, right? I would say the composition's quite simple, but I think the hardest part was really finding those subtle temperature shifts in the shadow, because I think the shadow is what is so interesting, the shadow of the rocks, and then the really beautiful glisten in the water against the shadow of those rocks. So you can see that I'm searching here and there, and I think I kind of butcher it in the middle, and then I bring it back. So you'll see me do all that, and that's honestly the fun journey of painting, right? It's never always smooth sailing because you're searching, you're trying, and I like to say that there's almost no such thing as you can overwork a painting, but you can also learn a lot because you're problem solving. So I don't stop if I think I've overworked it. I just keep going and going, and I just figure out how to fix it, and that helps me with my problem solving skills. So you can see that I'm just dry brushing a little bit of the palm tree leaves now, utilizing that dry brushing effect again to get the coarseness of the leaves, right? I'm not actually going to paint every single leaf, right? That would be way too time consuming. Dry brushing it is, again, great for just implying that coarseness. And so that's why it's a really fun technique to practice with gouache. And if you're new to gouache, what I just suggest is just playing around on a piece of paper, right? Just play around on a piece of paper, practice, playing around with the amount of water that you have to paint, and just practice making these random strokes and seeing the textures that it gives you. So now what I'm trying to do is I'm switching back to the round brush, and I'm just seeing if I can push a little bit of dark, deep saturation. So I'm mixing alizarin crimson with a little bit of brilliant green to, desaturate it a little bit and cool it down slightly, right, with the complement of brilliant green. And I think it's kind of working. And the reason why I know I can also try this is because I actually did a digital painting study of this. And with the digital painting study, I was really seeing how much I could push the saturation and the shadows, which was really fun. And something that I've lately been trying is really to see how far I can push saturation in shadows while maintaining the correct value. Okay, and that's very important. Nikolai Fechin does this, so an artist that is great to study is Nikolai Fechin, and he is so good at just utilizing his grays, but then in areas of his paintings, you'll just see like almost raw pigment, like a little bit of permanent yellow deep, a little bit of alizarin crimson, blue, just kind of textured and palette knifed on very delicately, and it just creates such a nice vibration. So I'm keeping that all in mind as I'm really trying to tastefully push saturation of the right value. Okay, so the key word is of the right value, because if I just push saturation with no regard to value, I'm going to break the illusion of light and shadow in my painting, and it's not going to work. For example, that yellow stroke I just put down there that I'm covering now, that was the wrong value. So that started to read like it was in the light, and it didn't feel right, okay? Now this brilliant green that I'm putting down, just trying something, but I think it's too cool. So now I'm just mixing a little bit of red in to also cover that in as well. And just really playing around with, maybe I can push a little bit of ultramarine, which is the darkest color I have on my palette, right? So I don't have black. Therefore, I know that the darkest color I can get is ultramarine, and maybe even ultramarine with red with no white, okay? That's also important to know because, that will be my darkest dark, and then the lightest light is white, of course. Maybe even white mixed with a little bit of lemon yellow, which is what I like. I don't ever like to put just straight white. I always mix a little bit of lemon yellow in. So this is about the time when I think I'm ruining my painting because, I don't know, the strokes that I'm putting down, the temperature shifts don't really make sense. There's like weird dark patches here and there. There's like this weird light blue patch in the mid-ground cliff. And it's just it's not really making sense. So in times like these, it's okay to just step back, take a breather, walk away, and come back with fresh eyes, right? Sometimes the colors will dry a little bit different in gouache, so sometimes it's a really good idea to wait that way. But patience is important. So I just got to start seeing how I can fix it. Now, see here what I'm doing is I'm trying to lighten up the value a little bit with ultramarine and a little bit of white, just to pop that really nice blue atmosphere just in little places. Okay, so you see that I'm popping it not everywhere, but just in some places. Now that blue is mixing in with my still wet yellow ochreish paint underneath. And so I'm blending that way a little bit. I actually hardly ever paint like this, like with a small round brush like that, trying to blend. Usually I'm painting with a big flat brush or something, but I don't know, I'm just trying new things here. So usually I'm using a flat brush and just covering the shape in one go. But you can see, that's what I mean, with ultramarine and white, it actually adds a nice, cool atmospheric touch that now contrasts nicely with the other warms that I have in other places. But there's still some values that need some fixing. So I'm going to just slowly finesse that, right, as we go along. Now you can see what just happened is that when you put paint on and the paint on the canvas is still dry, it just moves it around, and sometimes that's not what you want, right? So I actually wanted to dry brush there, and I didn't want to move the wet paint around. So sometimes you just have to wait. Yeah, the paint is still wet. And I will say in this case, I'm painting on cold pressed watercolor paper with the brand Fluid. Okay, so I'm using a watercolor block 6x8. I find that 6x8 is a really great size to practice doing studies. Not too big, not too small. So 6x8, 5x7 are great sizes. And I personally like cold press because I like the texture that it gives you, but you can use hot press. It's really up to you. So I put down that stroke because I was looking and I was like, there needs to be more grouping in the cliffs, okay? When I squint at the reference photo, I like how that whole shadow side is grouped into one big shape, but just these subtle kind of half tones or like really soft highlights, like just the glisten of the rocks, right? Or maybe a patch of green. So I'm really trying to regroup again. And the cool thing about gouache is that you can re-wet and smudge essentially and just recreate shapes and just carve in and carve out and recreate shapes. So if you just wet gouache, it will just reactivate and you can smudge around and move around your paint. It's very forgiving that way, which is why I think it makes for a great medium. It is still frustrating, but it's still a great medium. But I can move around my paint that way by adding a little bit of water. So I apologize here, the video gets slightly blurry, but hopefully you can still see what's going on. And I think right now I'm just really searching for how I can connect my light and shadow shapes, and I'm struggling with that a little bit. And it's always this push and pull, oh, that light shape now separated, the shadow a little bit too much, and it's drawing too much attention, or the shadow mask feels really uninteresting and just needs a little bit more breakage, to break up maybe some light shapes in between. And it's just really that search that is frustrating, but also, very fun. So right now I'm really just searching for that and just seeing how much I can push the warmth and the cool. So all I'm doing is just mixing different increments of ultramarine, alizarin crimson, and lemon yellow for the shadow. If I mix more ultramarine, it becomes cooler, right? And if I mix more alizarin crimson, it becomes more of a purple. And yellow ochre to me kind of balances it all out. So yellow ochre is like the mediator. But I think a lot of times we forget the power of red as well, like a good, deep, dark red, which can bring a lot of nice, subtle warmth in. And I also like mixing unconventional colors that you wouldn't think would go into rocks, right? So I'm not just mixing, like brown or, earthy colors. I love, mixing colors like brilliant green, which you wouldn't think would go into the rock. But brilliant green with alizarin crimson, again, can make a nice earthy gray, right? So thinking about those complements, again, is really key. And hopefully you can see now that the palm tree has dried a little bit. You can start to see the colors in that as well with a little bit of brilliant green peeking through. I'm going to use a sky later on to keep carving into the palm tree. And really just finessing my shapes a little bit more that way. So something I like to use with the round brush is dragging the brush across and creating these nice, really thin, delicate lines which is what I'm trying to do now. I'm trying to find like these delicate light shapes, just these patches of land that kind of describe the rock formation, but don't feel too evenly spaced or anything. So it was tricky. It looked easy in the photo, but it's kind of tricky to replicate that. Right now, I think the green I'm putting down is also a little bit too cool. So the brilliant green made it a little too cool, and I need to warm it up with yellow ochre. So I really like yellow ochre as a mediator, and you can see that I can always reuse the colors on the base of that I already have on my palette. Okay, so if I just re-wet it a little bit, or my brush is a little bit wet, I can just mix those colors back in. And that's what I mean by I really like reusing the colors that I have on my palette. So as I'm mixing more and more colors, the messier my palette is, the more confident I actually feel, ironically, because there's so much of those grays already, right, of different temperatures, warmer grays, maybe with a little bit of yellow ochre and alizarin crimson, or cooler grays with a little bit of ultramarine or brilliant green. And so I can recycle those colors, right? And Edward Seago once said, you know, the color that you see the most in nature is gray, but not one kind of gray, but so many different temperatures of grays, right? Silvery grays or warm grays or yellowish grays. And that's how I think about the world of grays in this context. You can see that my paint's a little bit wet. It's still in this wet phase that I'm like, ugh, just want it to dry already so I can see my colors. But you can see that I'm even using the flat brush to just add little dabs of color, right? And I think right now I haven't found a pleasing shape in the light. Like the green patches just feel kind of like claws. I just don't like how it looks like right now, so I hope I fix it up later. But those are things that I notice design-wise, right? It's like step back and kind of notice, okay, how can I just make those shapes a little bit more pleasing, so that, you know, a lot of times when we don't think about the shapes we put down, we tend to put down shapes of the same angle, the same size, the same proportion. So really keeping in mind and being aware of that will help you design better and put down more pleasing shapes in your light and shadow. But I will say, I think the temperature of the rocks feels a little bit more cohesive. It's not wildly fluctuating from warm to cool. There's a little bit more of a softer transition. So I think that might work, although we're still going to keep refining. And you can see what I'm doing now is I'm using the corner of the flat brush, right? The corner of the flat brush can actually allow me to get really small shapes, believe it or not. Don't believe me? Try it out yourself, right? Take a flat brush and just play around with it. And you'll find that you can get really, really nice small shapes. I keep wanting to pop the warmth in the rocks. So if I remember correctly, there's like this really subtle warmth of the rocks closer to the water. And I just want to pop that with a little bit of alizarin crimson, yellow ochre, mixed with a little bit of ultramarine, right? But again, I control the temperature of my grays by either mixing more warm colors like yellow ochre, lemon yellow, or alizarin crimson, or mixing a cooler color, in this case ultramarine. And that's how I control the temperature of my warms and my warmer and my cooler grays, right? I still haven't painted the house yet. There is a house, you know, a bunch of houses in the back, but I haven't really done that yet. And when I squint, you know, I think the shapes of the rocks could still be finessed a little bit more. And right now I'm trying to figure out how I can bring out the foreground. But I already know that I don't want the foreground to be super dark. I actually keep the foreground bush the same value more or less as the midground. And it just doesn't draw as much attention to it, in my opinion. So I'm going to refine that a bit more later. But for now, I'm just still figuring out shapes, okay? But you can see that I've largely slowed down, taking breaks, just like a minute break, squinting and stepping back at your painting is really important. So now I'm doing that technique again with just ultramarine and white, and I want to see if I can just pop some really nice, cool shadows. Just in some select places. Too much and it doesn't feel special, but it just has to be in certain places, just maybe, the planes of the rocks closer to the sky. I just want to push that back a little bit, and I think that looks kind of cool. There's still a little bit of glare, but once it dries, you can kind of see that it works. So I'm going to leave that there for now, and I'm going to just keep working on the ocean a little bit, dry brushing some of the glisten. And I think the ocean, it's important not to overdo something like water. I think when you start to try to paint every single glisten, it starts to look overdone. It's really about that implication that is more important, and that will actually feel more like water instead of painting every single wave or every single ripple and things like that. So when I paint water, I'm never really trying to paint everything that I see. It's about painting, just capturing the area of highest contrast with the glisten and then the water, and just letting everywhere else fall a little bit simpler. And now what I'm also starting to do is I'm going to now start punching in the sky, okay, the backlit aspect of the clouds. Now with the clouds, okay, I'm not pinning down pure white, and I'm actually using a fair amount of water, because sometimes when it dries, it'll dry that value, and it won't dry too dark when you use water, when you use the right amount of water. I find it to be very finicky. So it works sometimes and it doesn't work. I guess I just haven't mastered that technique yet, but I'm actually mixing white with lemon yellow, maybe like a teeny bit of green. Okay, like it's very light, but it's not pure white, because I don't want it to be as light as my water. So, and you can see now I'm carving into my clouds. And I will say that if I was careful from the beginning, I could have used the tone of my canvas as the light side, the backlit area of the clouds. Because I wasn't, and I just blocked in this blue from the sky, now I essentially have to repaint the backlit aspect of the clouds, right? The rim of the clouds that are being lit by the sun. So this is my second choice. My first choice would have been to be really careful and block in the shadow of the clouds, and then use the tone of the canvas to leave as a backlit aspect. But, I didn't do that. So now I have to redo it. So now I'm using a bit more paint. I'm dry brushing a little bit more. You can see the texture starting to pile on a little bit. And I'm going to need to refine those shapes so they don't feel so clumpy, but at least I'm now starting to break up the sky a little bit more. Now I'm using water to just soften the edge a little bit. So with water, again, you can soften the edge, right? With more water, you can smudge and soften. With less water, you can dry brush and add texture that way. So now you can see I let my paints dry a little bit more, and now I can see them better, and I recommend that as a good time to take a break, right? Just letting it dry doesn't take long, and then coming back to the painting. And now what I'm doing is, now this is the phase where I slow down, okay? It's not about doing big, fast strokes anymore. It's really about slowing down and adding these tiny shapes that can make or break your painting. So right now I'm just breaking up that giant shadow mass with these tiny highlights on the rocks, right? The light is hitting the rim of these rocks. It's catching the light. And it just does everything to just give the feeling of sunlight hitting the rocks. And you can see that it didn't take much, right? It didn't take much. It was like one or two tiny dots, tiny strokes, and voila, it feels like those rocks are being hit by light. And that's why I like to say that every stroke you put down is a shape, right? And that can hurt your painting or make your painting better. So it's important to be aware of that, right? Be aware of the shapes that you're putting down, right? Of every stroke that you're putting down. Step back. The best way to be aware is to step back, because sometimes I get it. When your face is in a painting, you're so focused on something, you get tunnel visioned, and then it's really hard to see sometimes that what you're doing is not working, that it's not helping the painting, and you have to step back or take a picture of it and see if it's working or not. Another tactic that I didn't do is looking at your painting in a mirror, so it's flipped. That always helps to see what shapes aren't working. I definitely need to do that more, but all good techniques. So I'm squeezing a little bit more brilliant green because I'm running out. Just a little bit to mix with my linden green and yellow ochre. Just kind of gets that nice balance of warm and cool. Okay, but a little bit of brilliant green will go far. And I just want it to pop, just little areas to pop in saturation, not too much. So every time when I think it's too cool, I mix a little bit of yellow ochre to just bring in some of those neutral tones a little bit more, right? Yellow ochre is one of my favorite colors. I use it all the time to tone my canvas, and it's my neutral earth tone, right? You can mix yellow ochre with lemon yellow, alizarin crimson, and ultramarine. I've done it before. You just have to balance the amounts, right? But you can definitely do it. Now what I'm doing is I'm just adding some foreground glisten in the foliage in the foreground. I want to keep the foreground abstract. I'm not really caring to paint, twigs or anything, but I definitely want to keep it a little bit more abstract and just kind of capture the mass of it, kind of have everything linked together, but still have a separation in foreground, midground, and background. And I know there's a lot of houses, but I'm just going to focus on one house and kind of just imply the other ones. So I'm just blocking that in a little bit and, filling in those light shapes, the tone of my canvas that now feel too light and are maybe catching attention a little bit too much, right? And I'm going back to the water again, because now I'm feeling that my water needs a little bit of love. It needs these delicate small shapes, right, to really capture that bing, that glisten of the water. So I've got a good blocking of the water, but I definitely need to add a few smaller shapes. And so I'm using a lot of white, and I'm just kind of dragging it across, creating short, spunky strokes. I don't know if that made sense, but short strokes, right? And just trying to drag and dry brush and clean up the edges of my rocks that way a little bit more. And it might look like I've covered the tone of my canvas, but there's still some peeking through. I didn't cover it completely. And it's very easy to, I will say, it's very easy to go paint crazy and then cover the beautiful tone of your canvas. I did this all the time when I started out gouache painting, and it took me a few months to realize, like, oh man, I should really be keeping the tone of the canvas, especially for things like sunsets. That's a big trick. For sunsets, the glow of a sun, like, keep the tone of the canvas, because that's going to be a lot easier and faster than trying to, paint thick yellow paint on or something. So right now you can see that yellow actually feels really nice against the purple, right? They're kind of vibrating against each other. But what I've accidentally done is I've ruined the horizon line, the water line, and it's crooked now. So I'm going to need to fix that a little bit later. I don't use rulers, so it's sometimes my lines are crooked. But I do like how the yellow feels against that mountain in the back. I'm just playing around now. Now what I'm doing is I'm mixing a little bit of alizarin crimson with a lot of white just to get these pink jewels in the water. A little bit of lemon yellow as well. And you can see I'm popping that, and that warmth actually just does a lot and just bringing the twinkle of the water. I don't know how to quite explain it, but it's just the color relationships that are really working, right? So a lot of times people will just think water's blue and that's it. Just use blue and white, right? There's so much more subjective color that you can put in that I'm showing you now, right? And you can see that the white with alizarin crimson actually makes a kind of pink. And it just really now feels like light is hitting the water even more, that hot glare kind of happening right there. I'm really slowing down now. So a lot of the changes that I'm going to do are going to be slower, and they're going to be small. Okay, they're not going to be big strokes, and I'm just going to be, refining shapes here and there. Now what I need to do is I need to cut into to those distant palm trees, right? Some of them are feeling a bit crude, so I'm just using a round brush and poking holes into the trees, essentially sky holes. And like I said earlier in this video, that's how I like to carve my shapes, right? If I worked background to foreground, I don't think I would get this chance as much. I still could, but I find that you get more creative with carving shapes through this way. So I'm actually also trying to lighten the sky as well in the process. So I'm almost adding more white than I think I need to, because I know it's going to dry a little bit darker. So you can see on my palette, it's quite light, and it maybe looks a little bit darker on the canvas, but I know that it's just going to dry a little bit darker. Cleaning up the edges of the palm tree a little bit so my pen from my initial sketch doesn't show through. But you can see that those pinks from my pen sketch, I like the way they show through. Like, it just adds a little bit of, I don't know, character or something. So I personally always like to keep a little bit of pen sketch because it makes it feel kind of less refined. I don't know, like more down to earth. I don't even know if that made sense, but I just like seeing bits of the sketch come through, so it's not so perfect and tight, I guess. Just finessing the foreground a little bit and using the water to carve the foreground elements now, right? So mixing a little bit of ultramarine and white just to get the foreground a little bit darker, but I have to be careful because it can dry darker, and I think now it's already a little bit too dark. So I'm just mixing a little bit more white in to lighten it up. And that's why you need a lot of white, right? You need a lot of white because white is going to lighten but also desaturate your color, okay? So keep that in mind. White lightens and desaturates. But because ultramarine is such a dark value to start with, I cannot put pure ultramarine in the water, right? That would be completely the wrong value. So I know that I need to mix a lot of white. And now you get that kind of nice cool in the foreground and transitioning to warmer tones in the background, which I kind of like. But I'm going to keep adjusting. Now I'm just poking in slightly cooler, darker values to highlight the glisten even more. And you can see I'm basically just putting down like a tapping motion, right? Just little dots here and there to try to get that glisten. Mixing more white into that ultramarine, maybe a little bit of yellow. Now to get maybe a greener, kind of a light green kind of deal going on the foreground. And I have, a little bit of water in my brush right now. So it's not dry brushing right now completely. A little bit of water, and we'll see how that dries. Right now what I'm doing is I want to see if I can pop the warmth in the rocks even more. So I'm putting pure alizarin crimson with a little bit of yellow ochre, and then just popping these jewels of warmth just a little bit in select places. Let's just see how that feels, right? Believe it or not, there's a lot of warmth and shadows, right? Because there's bounce light going on. So shadows aren't just gray, they're not just cool. Shadows consist of just a beautiful blend of warmer and cooler grays. And like I said, it's important to step back and see. Right now what I'm doing is I'm just having a little bit of water in my brush, and I'm just trying to smudge some edges. So like I said before, if you just have a clean brush, it's important to have a clean brush so you don't smudge color you don't want onto your painting. You can dip your brush in a little bit of water and just rub it on your painting, and that can start to soften the edge a little bit. So I want to emphasize again that there's so many colors you can mix with just the primaries, right? You can mix green from yellow ochre and ultramarine, or you can mix a green from lemon yellow and ultramarine, and that would give you two different kinds of greens. Yellow ochre and ultramarine would give you a sappy green, a little bit less saturated, because yellow ochre is so much more of an earth tone. But lemon yellow and ultramarine would give you some, like a much more vibrant green, right? And so utilize that. If you add more purple to your ultramarine, that would be a warmer purple. If you add more ultramarine, that would make a more cooler purple, right? So there's so many different slight variations. What else? With, yellow ochre and white feels different than lemon yellow and white, right? One would feel warmer, one would feel cooler. And so really play with temperature that way. So what I'm going to start doing now is actually never utilize lemon yellow with ultramarine. So I want to actually dry brush that in the foreground. And I think that really actually separates the foreground a little bit more. Just a little bit, you see, against that warmer base does a lot. And that's just ultramarine and lemon yellow, right? So I'm dry brushing that. And because that green is the same value as the colors I have below, that warmer kind of tone, you just get this nice transition of temperature without that value change, right? So it's all similar value, and I actually really like how that looks. So I'm going to keep that there. And now I'm going to keep refining the background a little bit, because I don't like how thick some of the palm trees look. Could probably, work on the shapes on the background palm trees a little bit more, but still keep them pretty graphic and pretty stylized. Some of the stems start to feel a little bit thick, so gonna fine tune that later. But now I'm just going back to my water again. And you can see I'm utilizing that dry brush effect, and that just kind of creates this nice mist, like the water is just hitting the rocks a little bit. So by dry brushing almost white, it's white with lemon yellow, it's almost like kind of creating the effect of water hitting against the rocks, right? I would not be able to achieve this effect with a wetter brush. So I really need to make sure my brush is dry and not a lot of water, because even if you have a little bit of water, it can ruin the effect of the dry brushing. What I'm also going to try to do now is I thought, let me just try to push some pure like purple with alizarin crimson and ultramarine. So I want to see if I can push that a little bit. But I will say that too much and everything starts to feel too cool. So you just got to be really careful with that. And of course, be very careful with your values, okay? A dark value now would stand out way too much if I put that down. And something too light would also stand out too much as well. So I'm just trying to be very, very careful with that. That might be too warm in some places. So I really have to make sure that I'm not going to put that purple everywhere. Now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to use actually a little bit of water in my brush to just soften the edge and straighten up the edge a little bit, because it's crooked. And that's not quite working. So unfortunately, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to paint the cliffs in the back again. And the pain is that I'm going to have to match the value. So let's see what happens with that. Just fixing up the palm tree a little bit. But I'm going to fix that up a little bit later. Right now the water line still feels a little bit wonky. So now what I'm doing is I'm using a really fine rigger brush. I believe this is a Princeton O-2 brush, like a really thin rigger brush. And a rigger brush is really great for just getting nice, beautiful tapered lines. That's how you get really beautiful branches, for trees. And I used to be against using small brushes. Like, oh, no small brushes. You got to know how to, use simple big brushes. But now I've changed my mind. After you've blocked in a painting, something like a rigger brush can really add those nice finer details in the right places. And I don't mean detail, actually. I just mean like just these finishing touches, I guess you could say. Now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to mix back the color of the cliff in the back, the mountain, to cut into my palm trees because some of them are feeling kind of crude. And it's a little bit too cool now. And you're going to see now how sometimes with water, it just dries kind of funny. So sometimes the pain is that if you don't nail the values on the first or second try, you have to, kind of go over it. And that can be difficult, right? It's hard to mix the color that you had. It's never going to be exactly the same. So I'm just going to have to adjust and see. But you can see that it was a little too cool. So I just put a little bit of ultramarine in. A little bit of alizarin crimson in later on. And I'm just fine-tuning the edge, the top of that rock. Therefore, carving it at my house a little bit more. But you can see that just feels kind of funny. It's like cool and then warm. So I need to find a way to make that transition. And in my brain, I'm like, oh man, I know this is going to be really difficult. It's really hard to paint light values that light and have it transition as nicely as I had before, kind of on the first try with the flat brush. Now that I'm repainting it over, I'm going to have to really make sure that the value is not too dark or not too light, because then I'll just have to paint the whole thing over. And that's happened a lot, But I like my strokes in the back, so I don't want to have to repaint the whole thing over. You can see that I just put down a dirty stroke. I need to clean my brush a little bit. But I'm just trying to match it. So you see, I'm tapping very lightly on my paint, by the way. If you just scoop a little bit too much, that's going to affect the value, right? So I'm tapping very delicately. That was too warm. Now I'm adding blue, and we'll see if that works. I'm putting it down. Flat brush really helps get that graphic shape, right? And cover more mass quickly. So I'm like, okay, that might kind of work. Now it's transitioning. I'm now turning my brush to get the edge, the corner to kind of carve into those shapes. And I'm thinking that could work, right? It feels like that mountain is really pushed back in atmosphere now. But you're going to see it's going to dry kind of funny. You can already start to see it happening in real time. That's kind of what happens when there's too much water in the paint. It dries kind of in splotches. So just kind of let it do its thing a little bit, and then we'll adjust from there. But meanwhile, I'll just, now I'm using the rigger brush, that really, really, really thin brush, and I'm just adding tiny dots, and I just love the complexity and shapes that it brings, right? Just brings these nice, delicate, smaller shapes that you really can't get with other brushes. So I'm just really delicately just tapping and adding that extra glisten in the water. Hopefully I haven't overdone it. Just adding, I don't know what else to call it, the glisten in the water. But you can see now that patch of water right in the center of my painting is starting to drive me nuts, right? So we'll see how we can fix that. Now the tricky part with rocks is that it's really easy to add a bunch of small rocks and then they're just equally spaced and it doesn't look pleasing. So I'm really trying to make sure that I don't do that, right? That, I'm varying the shapes and the grouped mass of the rocks and then having some stragglers of smaller rocks to the right. But I want to make sure that they're not all equally spaced that there forms an interesting pattern that can lead my eye around. So now is the time when I really encourage you to slow down. If you're following along with this tutorial, don't rush it, right? Really just be aware of each stroke that you're putting down, how it affects your painting. You can see that the strokes I'm putting down are a lot smaller. They're not grand, they're not gestural, but I'm really just seeing how, obviously also waiting when it dries to see how it affects my whole painting as a whole. And you can see now that water splotch in the middle of the cliff, it's still drying, it's still kind of wet, but you can kind of see how it's going to dry in a splotchy kind of way, I think. So I just got to be aware of that and fix that a little bit more. But right now what I'm trying to do is I'm using a smaller round brush and mixing white and yellow ochre. Not a lot of white because I don't want these subtle rim lights to stand out too much. I just want to define the rock shapes a little bit more, right? I want to give a little bit of implication, but not have it be too much contrast. So what I'm doing now in the cliffside is a technique of just, while the paint's still wet, I'm using a flat brush and I'm moving the paint around. And that actually seemed to work quite well in this instance. You can see that I've gotten rid of that splotch, but we're going to have to see how it dries. That's how gouache is a little bit unpredictable. It's still a little bit wet, but at least I've moved the paint around a little bit and I was able to blend it a little bit more that way. But you can see that now there's still an edge kind of more in the right side now. So we'll see how we can go about and end up touching that up a little bit as well. So now what I'm going to do is I'm trying to mix that cliff color again, and I'm trying to straighten out the bottom of the mountains to get a straighter water line. This is tricky because you see I'm not quite mixing the right color. It's a little bit cooler, but I'm hoping that it'll just kind of dry a little bit more similar, but I'm just kind of creating a harder edge that way, going along the base. This is not really how I typically, tackle something. Usually I would just kind of paint it again with a flat brush, but right now I really don't want to risk mixing a color that's too dark, which is usually what happens. So I'm just really carefully going along the edge. You can see it just kind of slightly cooler. It's not perfect, but the value is about the same. So hopefully it'll dry, to just about right. I'm also darkening the edge of the water just a little bit on the right side. And you can see now that the water's a little bit straighter, although I think I put down some values that were too dark in the water, but we'll see. We'll even it out a little bit. So every time you put down a value that's too dark, fear not. You can mix white in as well, and that will lighten up a color. Or you can take your brush and kind of just lighten up the color by rubbing your brush into the paint a little bit and lightening the color that way. So using water to lighten up the values. I tend to just paint thicker and thicker, so I'll just tend to layer the color more. So I'll just mix more white into my color and layer on top of that. But again, an important note that I want to note with layering and gouache is that to layer and get that dry brush technique, the paint below has to be dry already. So if you're just trying to layer with wet brush strokes, with wet paint underneath, it's not going to work. It's just going to kind of become this like splotchy mess. So make sure you keep that in mind as well. So you can see here that I'm using water to just erase, and that's a really a great technique for editing, right? So sometimes instead of painting over, if you have a clean brush and you dip it in water and you just rub it against your canvas a little bit, you can soften and erase certain marks that you don't want. You can do that, I believe, at any part of the process. Just be careful with how much water you have on your brush, because if it's too much water, it'll just leave a kind of splotchy mess, right? So with gouache, it's always the ratio of water to paint, and too much water, sometimes that's what you want if you want a wet on wet and you want the colors to bleed. But usually I like to have just a little bit of water and more paint so that the strokes that I put on are thicker than wetter, and I can control it more that way. So that's usually how I like to build up my painting, from definitely wetter paint, thinner paint in the beginning, letting some colors bleed, and then I'll tighten and dry brush, add thicker paint, and build up that way with gouache. One thing I want to note is that with the clouds, you can see that I'm not using pure white anywhere. Okay, so the clouds are actually mixed with white and lemon yellow, which is giving it that kind of greenish tint in the light side. And you can see that I really haven't used white anywhere, not even for the water. And here is the final painting. So I hope that you have fun playing around with the primary palette. And this time I added a little bit of green. So I added linden green and brilliant green as my secondary colors. But I hope that you can see that with just a few colors, you can create so much vibrancy, so much liveliness in your painting. And it's a great practice to understanding how to mix your grays from your primaries and your secondaries, and really understanding how color relationships work. So give it a try and let me know what you think.